So what's the cause of cramps? Well, out of the 148 responses to this question on my channel, 100 people got it wrong. You see, I've helped plenty of runners who have come to me seeking help on how to stop cramps in a marathon. The thing is though, what they think is the cause of their cramps probably isn't actually the problem in most cases. In this video, I'm going to run through those pesky buggers that are cramps, what causes them, and offer practical solutions so that you can run a marathon without them. And if you're new here, then hey, my name's James and I'm a registered sports nutritionist. I work with amateur and professional endurance athletes to help them train and race better, improve their recovery, and do all of this in a healthy fashion. So, I've worked with runners and triathletes who have struggled with cramps in a marathon, and that's both in a marathon on its own or at the end of an Ironman. And if you look on YouTube or blogs, you'll see so many people complaining about cramps and how they've effectively ruined their race. They're so common, and lots of people think about salt or sodium when it comes to cramps. And the link here goes back to the early 1900s, when scientists started investigating this. In the 1930s, some crazy people started looking into this, and they wanted to see what happened when you restricted salt from a diet. So they did just that, and they also took hot baths to induce sweating. They reported symptoms such as fatigue, weakness, and our good friend cramps. Then they added salt back to their diet, and these symptoms settled down. There are also case studies in nutrition research and plenty of anecdotal stories too of athletes who have suffered with cramps, which have resolved or at least reduced when they've added more salt into their diet or more heavily replaced it during exercise. So this led to the notion that cramps are due to dehydration and a lack of sodium. Now this is definitely a potential cause. Sodium is heavily involved with muscular function and the proper firing of muscles, so a drop or a decline in sodium could cause this, but I don't actually think it's the case for a lot of people. Now this can actually get a bit awkward, because I have athletes who come to me asking for advice on how to optimize their sodium intake and stop cramps from happening. And when I tell them that actually it might not be the cause, it can be a bit of a difficult pill to swallow. Difficult salt pill to swallow? Bad pun? The other potential cause of cramps, in my opinion, which is the most common, is muscular fatigue. When you run, you put stress through your muscles, and they suffer little bits of damage and get tired. And if you repeat this enough times, they go, nope, I'm done, and they cramp. Now, as I said, I think this is the most common cause, and that's for a couple of reasons. I've worked with plenty of athletes who have had adequate sodium intake and an adequate nutrition plan, yet they still had cramps. I've also worked with athletes who have cramped within an hour or two of starting a race, despite starting it in a well-hydrated state. And it tends to be that the ones who are more likely to cramp are newer to running or haven't done that distance before. And as I'm going to talk about in a moment, there are some things that you can do to stop cramps from happening. Now, it's worth me saying that it might be a combination of these two things, or it might be a completely different cause, because in honesty, we don't know exactly what causes cramps or how to stop them happening every time. So let's go through some strategies to try and stop them happening in the first place. Now, there's a saying which I think is from the British military, which is that prior preparation prevents piss poor performance. And I think this is particularly important when it comes to cramps in a marathon. First of all is the importance of training and conditioning. It's really important to build your muscles up to give them time to adjust to the distance or the amount that you're running. And importantly, you need to be running at your intended race pace. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to run everything at race pace, and hopefully you'll have a well-structured running plan that will ease you into that and gradually build you up. But you do need to test it at your intended effort so that you know how your body is going to react, and importantly, to allow your muscles to adapt to that pace or effort. You should also try to train in the same conditions that you're expecting to run in. So that means wearing the same clothes, training at the same time of day in the same temperature. Because what you want to know is, do you get the cramps during training? And if so, at what temperature? How far into your run? Because these are things that you can use and then work on. It's also worth making sure that you've got the right gear for long distance running, which means wearing the right amount of clothes and not wearing too much and ending up overheating. Remember that you'll heat up as you start running, so just take that into account. Be bold, start cold. It's also important to have good shoes when you're running the sort of distance required for a marathon, and that's in training and during your actual race. If you have crap shoes, then that's going to put more stress on your muscles, more damage on your muscles, which is going to increase that risk of cramping. So yes, as much as I hate to say it, carbon shoes might help to reduce the risk of cramps during a marathon. The other thing we're trying to prevent cramps from happening in the first place is to make sure that your hydration and your nutrition is on point. So this means following best practice principles going into your race. So for example, from a nutrition point of view, that would be carbohydrate loading and having a good pre-race breakfast. This ensures you cover the energy side of things, making sure that you have enough carbohydrates for the race and reducing the risk that that's going to contribute in any way to causing cramps. Then it's making sure that you've got your nutrition sorted for the race itself. So whether you're using gels or drinks or chews or whatever it is that you want to do, making sure that you're consuming adequate carbohydrates to keep you well fueled throughout the race. From a hydration point of view, it's staying really well hydrated in the days before your race. And this is particularly important if you're carbohydrate loading, which you definitely should be, because what you'll find is when you carb load properly, you'll store more water with that carbohydrate, and you need to account for this and actually drink more. So my suggestion is to drink a little bit more than you would expect that day or two before your race, but also include some electrolyte tablets that have sodium in it, because this will help to ensure you absorb that water and keep your sodium levels up in your blood, which is really important. You also need to think about things like the climate in advance of your race and plan for this. So if it's going to be particularly hot or you think you are going to be really sweaty, then it might be worth consuming something like salt tablets early into the marathon to reduce that risk of cramping secondary to sodium. Now, everything that I've just mentioned there, so staying hydrated the day before your race, the pre-race breakfast, carb loading, and a nutrition plan for your race itself is covered in my running nutrition course. I cover this in a full module on race nutrition, and you'll also get access to a sweat tracker template as well as a race nutrition template, so you can personalize it to your needs. I've put a link to that in the comments section and the description of this video, so you can go and check it out. Now, the final thing to say in this how to prevent a cramp even happening in the first place section is have a good warm up. Now, this is anecdotal from my own experience and from working with runners, but warming up properly seems to reduce the risk of people cramping, so I would always advise it. You don't need to go nuts, but just get warm, do a bit of running, do a couple of high intensity bursts just to get things moving, and that should put you in a much better place. So let's say you've started the marathon. What can you do to prevent cramps from happening once you have? Well, most of you might be familiar with the story of the tortoise and the hare. It's a classic story about a slow and steady tortoise racing against a fast, overconfident hare. The hare, believing they're bound to win because of their speed, races on ahead and then decides to rest, confident in their lead. Meanwhile, the tortoise, known for their slow pace, steadily continues moving forwards without having a break. The hare eventually falls asleep, and while they are, the tortoise takes over and goes on to win the race. Now, I think this is a really nice way to think about your marathon, especially in terms of preventing cramps from happening. Start slow and work into it, and don't go off too fast or at an unrealistic pace. I know full well at the start of any race, you feel awesome, you feel energized, and there's so many people running around you that you just want to run. And what commonly happens is you go off and then you look down at your watch after a couple of minutes, or you even decide to run the first kilometer or mile, and then you go, I've gone off way too hard. Don't do that. Start easy and just work into it. Not only will you reduce the risk of cramping, you also minimize the risk that you burn through your carbohydrate stores. When you work harder than you can really sustain, you'll use more carbohydrate and you'll also create more lactate. Both of those things are not going to be helpful for running a good or fast marathon. Now, you also need to make sure that you keep up with your hydration and nutrition during your race. From a hydration point of view, I usually recommend runners to take between 300 to 600 milliliters of fluid per hour. This is totally dependent on the person, and some people will need and be able to tolerate more or less, and this is something to practice in training and then nail during your marathon itself. Now, for some marathon runners, water might be absolutely fine, especially if they've gone into the marathon in a really well hydrated state. And if they're going to be running under 4 hours, then they can probably get away with just drinking water and not worrying about sodium intake. However, if you're going to be running for longer than 4 hours, or you know you're a particularly salty sweater, or you're running in really hot or humid conditions, then you probably need to pay more attention to your sodium intake. Have a look at your race pack in advance and see if there are any aid stations that contain electrolyte drinks. If you want to use the on-course nutrition, then practice it during training to make sure that you get on with it okay. Otherwise, look at taking your own, either with a hydration pack or using something like salt capsules. Then just remember your carbohydrates. So make sure that you do have that good nutrition plan in place, and if you've forgotten or neglected your carbohydrates, make sure you take them. From a overheating dehydration point of view, it's also just worth considering cooling strategies in advance if it is going to be a particularly hot race. One of the things that you can do is start running the marathon with a frozen bottle in your hand. So you get the immediate benefit of a cold bottle which you can put on your head or your neck, and that's going to help to keep you cool, but as it unfreezes or thaws, that's the word, then you get a cold beverage to sip on whilst you're running as well, and that's just going to help reduce your core temperature from rising quite as much, which is going to reduce the effect of dehydration and overheating. In an Ironman, you could put something like this in the special needs area. Just check with the race organizer to make sure that that's okay and fits in with the rules. So let's say you've done all of what we've just talked about and you still get cramp during a race. What can you do? Well, the main one is to stop and stretch. In most cases, stopping and stretching will alleviate the cramps and mean that after a period of rest, you can get going again. Now, this is actually the reason why I think that dehydration and low sodium levels aren't actually the cause for most people. Stopping and stretching seems to be so effective for most people, and during that time they aren't taking on any extra fluids or sodium intake, yet the cramps stop. In my opinion, if it was genuinely due to low sodium, then that's unlikely to be the case. Then secondly, make sure that your carbohydrate, sodium and fluid intake are as expected. If you realized you've stopped following your plan, then try and get back on track with it, because that might sort things out. Then it's also worth considering whether it is genuinely a true cramp or not, and coming up with mental tactics to push through the discomfort. So when I did a middle distance triathlon, or Ironman 70.3 last year, I got onto the run leg, and within about 5 or 10 minutes, my quads were feeling so crampy and like they were going to seize up at any moment. It made me feel like I wanted to stop because I was worried about it coming on, but actually I kept running through it and it didn't ever materialize. So it might not always be a genuine cramp and actually more just fatigue and discomfort. So keep going and see whether you can actually push through that boundary. By exploring everything that we've talked about in this video, hopefully you can reduce your risk of cramping during a marathon. Now, preventing cramps from happening is one part of good marathon prep, but so is carb loading, and I've done a specific video on carb loading for a marathon, which I've put up on the screen and you can watch it now.